Imagine a man whose word could spark wars, yet whose body betrayed him with every breath. A king cloaked in velvet and gold, and beneath it, the scent of decay. This is not a fantasy. It is not some dark medieval legend. This was Henry VIII. But history, as it's told, hides what it dares not confront. We remember the 6 wives, the break from Rome, the portraits wide-eyed, solemn, deceptively noble. By the end, he wasn't just a man. He was a crumbling monument of flesh and fear. His legs split open with ulcers that never healed. His breath reeked of rot. Servants drew straws just to dress him. Some fainted from the smell alone. And yet, this walking corpse signed death warrants. He commanded armies. He reshaped religion, all while barely able to walk. Even in death, his body swelled with such ungodly gases that his coffin exploded. This is not taught in classrooms, but it happened, or so the records whisper. In this story, we journey into the shadows of royal halls, through veils of perfume and fear, to discover a king not remembered for how he lived, but how horrifyingly he died. By the final decade of his reign, Henry VIII had stopped resembling a man altogether. He had become something else, something grotesque, a figure swollen by power, paranoia, and decay, a corpse in royal robes. You've heard of kings who died on their thrones, but Henry was dying on the throne every day, inch by inch, not metaphorically, quite literally. He was a monarch whose very flesh turned against him. His legs were riddled with ulcers, open, festering craters that oozed pus and blood day and night. Some were so deep you could see down to the bone. Doctors dared not speak the truth. Even suggesting the king needed rest, or worse, that he was ill, could be construed as treason. So they said nothing, addressed the wounds. They masked the stench with herbs and rose oil. But it was never enough. There are whispers in old records. Some courtiers fainted just by entering the room. Others pressed perfumed cloths to their noses, trying not to gag. And the unlucky few, those tasked with dressing the king each morning, often drew lots. A grim lottery no one wanted to win. Imagine that. Standing before the most powerful man in England, and having to suppress the urge to vomit. And yet, this man, this decaying husk of royalty, still ruled, still dictated war and peace, still signed death warrants with a shaky, ink-stained hand. He could barely stand, let alone ride into battle. But his word carried more weight than 100 swords. Power, you see, has a strange relationship with the body. It can blind men to the truth. It can convince them and those around them that weakness is strength, and illness is merely divine trial. Henry believed that, or at least pretended to. But the truth was far darker. Contemporary scholars, with the luxury of hindsight and modern medicine, now suspect the king suffered from a deadly cocktail of conditions. Cushing's syndrome. A hormonal disorder that would explain the moon-shaped face, rapid weight gain, and constant infections. Type 2 diabetes, likely triggered by a diet of roasted meats, heavy ales, and mountains of sugar. And most chilling of all, a traumatic brain injury as a result of a jousting accident in 1536. He was unconscious for hours. When he awoke, something inside him had changed. Witnesses say he became erratic, quick to rage, prone to depression and violence. One ambassador described him as suspicious of all, trusting no one, and rarely smiling. Was this the moment the young athletic prince disappeared and the bloated tyrant emerged? The transformation was not just physical. It was spiritual, philosophical. Henry, once a golden-haired scholar king, began to see enemies in every shadow. His legs failed him, so he leaned harder on fear. His wounds grew worse, so he cloaked himself in divine righteousness. The worse his body became, the more violently he clung to power. And so, England became a kingdom ruled by a man falling apart. In the privacy of his chambers, Henry required custom-built contraptions just to move. Pulleys, slings, reinforced chairs. Couldn't climb stairs, couldn't bathe himself, couldn't even control his bowels. A special stool was built to accommodate his weight. It had wheels like a throne on tracks. Servants pushed him from room to room, sometimes with gloves, sometimes with masks, and yet none dared laugh. None dared look too long. To mock the king's condition was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. One slip of the tongue, one stray glance, and you could find yourself in the tower, or worse, headless at dawn. But here's the truly chilling part. As the king decayed, so did the line between man and myth. In portraits, Henry remained grand. Artists were instructed to slim the face, broaden the shoulders, and erase the wounds. The image had to remain intact, even as reality rotted. There is a story buried in the correspondence of a court painter that Henry once flew into a rage when shown a truthful sketch. He threw the ink pot across the room and screamed, "That is not me!" Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the king he once was had died long ago, and only the legend remained. The crown, after all, does not recognize infection or insanity or pain. It simply demands obedience. Historians debate, how could a man in such a state rule effectively? The answer is, he didn't rule alone. But Henry's inner circle learned to manipulate his moods. They whispered policies into his ear while massaging his swollen feet. They fed him gossip and flattery, while the kingdom slowly unraveled. England was not led by strategy or vision. It was ruled by the rotting mood of a dying man. And it showed. Taxes soared. Enemies multiplied. Trust vanished. People feared the king not because of his power, but because of his unpredictability. One day he might grant you land. The next, he might burn your family alive for a rumor. The crown now was a curse, and still, he ruled. Because that's the tragedy, isn't it? We think decay equals defeat, think disease humbles. But in history, power often outlives logic, outlives dignity. Henry's court became a theater of illusion. Curtains drawn over the smell, curtsies performed over bleeding bandages. Banquets served while the king's foot dripped onto the marble floor. The throne became a sarcophagus. The crown, a shackle of gold. They say, history is written by the victors. But sometimes, history is written by the ones too afraid to tell the truth. Henry VIII, the corpse that wore the crown, is remembered for his laws, his church, his wives. But beneath all that, he is a reminder of something darker. That even the most powerful among us can rot. Kings can die on their thrones. Not in glory, but in shame. Not in battle, but in bed, surrounded by whispers and filth. And that a body, no matter how royal, cannot outrun time. Inside the great halls of Whitehall Palace, silence had a sound. It wasn't the peaceful kind, no. This silence was thick, oppressive, like the air just before a storm. People didn't speak loudly. They didn't laugh. They didn't even breathe too deeply near the king. Because by the time Henry VIII reached his final years, his court wasn't a place of politics. It was a place of terror. He ruled with suspicion, and his paranoia was infectious. At night, Henry slept with a loaded crossbow beside his bed and a dagger under his pillow. But he didn't sleep alone. Guards were stationed inside his bedchamber, watching him as he slept, not to protect him, but because he demanded witnesses. He feared poisoning, feared betrayal, feared assassination. So he had passageways built, hidden tunnels running beneath the palace. Not for escape, not for secrecy, but for surveillance. He wanted to spy on those who might one day betray him, which to Henry meant everyone. He had peepholes drilled into walls, listening tubes placed in chambers. Most chilling of all, he created a network of spies to spy on his other spies. No one knew who they could trust, could befriend a fellow servant, only to learn they were reporting your words directly to the king. You could share a quiet joke about the royal waistline and find yourself dragged to the tower by morning. Even his own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were not spared. He had them followed, their letters intercepted, their rooms searched. To be royal in Henry's England was to live in a gilded prison, lined not with bars, but with ears. But what's most disturbing is how fast this fear spread. The nobility, once proud and powerful, became sycophants. They bowed too deeply, laughed too loudly. They began reporting one another, not out of loyalty, but to save themselves. A whispered comment in a hallway could lead to an execution. A dream, yes, a dream, was once used as evidence of treason. A man was put to death because someone claimed he dreamed of the king's downfall. You see, When power rots, so does reason. Henry didn't need proof, he needed suspicion. Was always in good supply, and suspicion. Every meal became a military operation. Food was tested by multiple servants. Each taster had to eat in front of armed guards and wait 30 minutes before the king would even consider touching a bite. Every fork, every goblet, every crumb, inspected. Even the water had to be drawn from secure wells and passed through loyal hands. The salt was tested separately from the bread. The wine was poured in another room, in case the smell of treachery could be detected. A royal feast could take hours. Not because of indulgence, but because of fear. Imagine the irony. Henry, once the Golden Prince of England, now cowered before his own kitchen, was his throne, but perhaps the most grotesque symbol of his paranoia. By the end, Henry had a special chair built, wide reinforced, with hidden wheels. It wasn't just a seat of power, it was a device of control. He would be wheeled into court slowly, looming over those summoned before him. A massive, wheezing, half-rotted giant, cloaked in furs and jewels to hide the reality beneath. He would glare down at trembling nobles, barking orders through cracked lips, his voice carrying the weight of hundreds of deaths behind it, and they obeyed. Is that Henry may not have even realized the monster he had become. Not out of love, not out of loyalty, but because the throne had become a guillotine in disguise. What's most tragic? In his mind, he was still the anointed one, God's chosen king, above the sickness, above the pain, above judgment. But power had isolated him from the very humanity he once embodied. He believed himself divine, even as his skin peeled from his legs, long after his mind and his body had begun to rot. He thought himself invincible, even as his flesh collapsed under its own weight. The only thing left intact was his will. And it was that will, iron and mad, that kept the kingdom in his grip. To live under Henry in his final years was to serve a ghost that refused to die. It's not a ghost of the dead, but of the living. A king whose body had become a tomb, whose palace echoed with secrets, and whose eyes scanned every face for betrayal. He didn't rule England, he haunted it. And for those inside the palace walls, escape wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. Because the danger wasn't outside. The danger sat on the throne. They called him Defender of the Faith. They painted him as a lover, a leader, a lion among kings. But behind the throne, behind the stained glass windows, and the orchestras of praise, stood 6 women, each chosen, loved, until they weren't. This isn't a story of romance. It's not even a story of betrayal. It's a story of control, of psychological warfare waged not on enemies, but on wives. Take Anne Boleyn, for example, the most famous, perhaps. She wasn't just executed, she was broken. The king didn't simply sign her death warrant. He orchestrated a masterpiece of cruelty. He had her arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. But these weren't just lies, they were performances. Before Anne was led to the scaffold, Henry made her watch. Yes, watch, as 5 men were executed. 5 men accused of sleeping with her, including her own brother. She stood behind the curtains as heads fell. The blade hit bone. Blood pooled on the scaffold, all while she waited for her own turn. There was no proof, just whispers, and Henry's all-consuming suspicion. It wasn't about justice. It was about humiliation, to destroy her, publicly, so no one else, no woman, would dare challenge him again. But Anne wasn't the only one. There was Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood when she married him. She was a teenager. Henry at that point was a rotting man, overweight, infected, and volatile. When rumors surfaced about her past, about a boy she once loved, Henry didn't question her. He didn't even ask. He passed a law, a new law, one that made it high treason to withhold details of a woman's sexual history before marrying the king. Let that sink in. He changed the law after marrying her, and then used it to justify her execution. Catherine was dragged from her room screaming, begging for her life. She never stood trial. She was never allowed a defense. Her last words whispered at the scaffold, "I die a queen, But I would rather die the wife of Culpeper, the man she once loved. And then there was Anne of Cleves, the one who survived. But not because Henry was merciful. No, because Anne knew how to lose, strategically. Henry didn't find her attractive. He called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was political, arranged through paintings and promises. But when he saw her in person, he recoiled, and Anne saw the danger. She claimed the marriage was never consummated. He asked. No, she begged. For an annulment, Henry granted it, and in return gave her a title. The king's sister. House. Protection. She was heard saying, I may not have been queen, but I kept my head. She was given estates, and she never looked back. Years later, in Henry's England, that was a win. These weren't love stories. They were political chess matches, where the queen was always the most vulnerable piece. Divorce wasn't an escape. Running away meant death. Fighting back, it meant public annihilation. Not just of the woman, but often of her entire family. Consider Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. They were married for over 2 decades. She gave him a daughter, Mary, but no son. And for that, she was discarded. Not quietly either. He waged a war against her, legally, spiritually, publicly. Separated her from her child, spread rumors that she was insane, kept her under virtual house arrest, forbidden to see her daughter ever again. She died alone, writing letters to Henry that were never answered. Some historians suspect she was slowly poisoned. Her only crime? A uterus that didn't produce a male heir. Even Jane Seymour, the so-called lucky one, the only wife who died naturally, wasn't spared the curse of the crown. She gave Henry what he wanted most, a son, and for that, she was celebrated. But she died just 12 days after childbirth, from complications that modern medicine could have treated. While her body was still warm, Henry was already meeting with ambassadors to discuss his next marriage. 12 days. That's all the time it took for a dead queen to be replaced. 6 women. 6 lives, each shaped by a single man's insecurities. Some lost their heads. Some lost their freedom. Some lost their very identities. Henry's relationships weren't marriages. They were stages, platforms where he could act out his fantasies and punish those who failed to play their parts. And yet, in paintings and textbooks, these women are often reduced to labels. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, a rhyme, a joke. But behind that rhyme is a symphony of screams, of betrayals, of quiet suffering behind locked doors. They weren't just wives. They were witnesses to Henry's madness, to his descent, to the rot, not just of his body, but of his soul. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. Not that a king could have 6 wives, but that he could destroy 5 of them and still be called glorious. That power could twist love into torture, marriage into death, and that for centuries. We'd be taught to remember him, not as the man who broke his wives, but as the king who had them. At the center of every royal banquet was a mountain, not of gold, not of scrolls, but of meat. Imagine it. The great hall at Whitehall, torches flickering against stone walls. Servants moving in disciplined silence carrying trays stacked high with roasted swans. Glazed boars, sugar sculptures taller than a child. And at the far end of the table sat a god. At least that's how Henry VIII saw himself. He didn't just eat to live. He devoured. Not like a man satisfying hunger, but like a king consuming loyalty. Like a tyrant demanding tribute from his own kitchen. Historians estimate Henry consumed up to 5,000 calories per day. That number is almost comical today until you realize he could barely walk. He wasn't burning energy. He was stockpiling it. Layering fat like armor against the world. Whole pigs. Dozens of chickens. Eels in cream sauce. Pastries stuffed with raisins and goose fat. Barrels of claret and sack. And he didn't just eat like that on holidays. This was daily ritual. This was royal law. While peasants in nearby villages lived off watery porridge and boiled roots, the king was tasting peacock brains, dormice pies, and pearled oysters imported by ship just for his supper. But it wasn't just volume that made it grotesque. It was meaning. You see, Henry believed food carried power. He thought that eating swan would make him more graceful, that venison would improve his hunting prowess. that oysters would enhance his potency in bed. He wasn't dining, he was casting spells. Each dish was a ritual, each bite a form of spiritual alchemy, transforming flesh into strength, fat into legacy. And the entire court played along, because no one dared challenge a king who believed his appetite was divine. But make no mistake, these were not meals, they were performances. Each dinner lasted hours. Servants didn't just cook, they choreographed. Food was carried in on silver platters, music played, trumpets announced courses. A single roast might be flanked by 6 carved birds, garnished with edible gold and saffron flown in from the east, and before a single bite touched his lips. Someone else had to try it first. Multiple food tasters, men sworn to loyalty and silence, sampled every bite before it reached the king. But even that wasn't enough. Henry required them to wait 30 minutes after tasting, to see if they would collapse from poison.
Oh.
Only then would the fork rise. Ironically, while he obsessed over imaginary poisons, he was slowly poisoning himself. Meat-heavy diets, rich sauces, refined sugar in quantities no human body was made to process. By his 40s, his health was crumbling, not from daggers or intrigue, but from gluttony. His body ballooned. Ulcers festered on his legs, partly due to circulation collapse from the weight. Gout ravaged his joints. Digestion slowed to agony. He spent hours on the toilet, often needing help to rise. His breath reeked of ferment and bile. The kitchen never stopped cooking. But the king was rotting from the inside out. And here's the bitterest irony of all. Henry had banned common foods from his table. No barley, no turnips, no lentils. Those were foods for peasants, he claimed, too humble for a monarch of divine authority. But the truth, those very foods, those earthy, fibrous, simple plants, might have saved him. Barley could have soothed his digestion. Turnips could have provided vital nutrients. Legumes could have balanced the meat-heavy excess. But he rejected them, not for health, but for image. Because to eat like a commoner was to admit you were mortal. And Henry, above all else, refused to believe he was just a man. His gluttony became legend. It was whispered in French courts, mocked in German sketches, feared in his own kitchens. It wasn't that he simply overate. It was that he believed his body was a throne, and that no consequence could touch him as long as he feasted like a god. But the body doesn't care for titles, yet the body breaks, it decays, it rebels, spectacularly. By the end, he couldn't stand. Meals had to be brought to his bedchamber. Servants described the sound of him chewing as a wet, grinding noise, his jaw swollen and inflamed, struggling to process even soft meats. And yet, he still demanded oysters. He still believed in magic meals, still hoped perhaps that one more swan, one more goblet, one more buttery pie might bring back the vigor of youth, or silence the stench of death. But food is not forgiveness, and the body keeps the score. Henry's collapse wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A king who consumed his kingdom, and in doing so, consumed himself. If Henry VIII ever had a true, unwavering companion, it wasn't a queen, it wasn't his council, it wasn't even God, it was paranoia. He married 6 women, betrayed friends, executed allies, turned faith into weaponry. But paranoia? Paranoia never left his side. As his body bloated and broke, his mind twisted inward. Every cough became a conspiracy. Every whisper, a warning. By the final decade of his life, the royal palaces were not halls of splendor, but labyrinths of dread. Secret passageways tunneled through stone walls, not for escape from enemies, but from imagined assassins. Peepholes were cut into chambers, so Henry could spy on his own court, his friends, his family, his lovers. Even his meals, once grand performances, became military operations. Multiple food tasters, guards watching the cook, sealed doors, tested water, tested salt, because Henry believed everyone wanted him dead, and he acted like it. At night, he didn't just sleep in a bed. He slept surrounded by weapons, loaded crossbows near the pillows, daggers beneath the mattress. Armed guards were ordered to stay awake in his chamber, but never look him in the eyes. What kind of man must you be to fear your own protectors more than your enemies? In Henry's final years, the court transformed into a stage of silent terror. People disappeared, vanished overnight after a misplaced word or a suspicious glance. Some were imprisoned not for crimes, but for thoughts, whispers, dreams. There are records, yes, real records, of Henry executing men because he had dreams they would betray him. He didn't wait for proof. He didn't want proof. His fear became law. That law was arbitrary, unpredictable, insatiable. It didn't end with his counsel. Even his daughters, Princess Mary and the young Elizabeth, were watched as though they were conspirators, waiting. They were children. But Henry saw only threats. He had guards monitor their conversations. He intercepted their letters. He feared they would rise against him, or worse, be used by others to take his throne. So he distanced them, silenced them, watched them. And in doing so, he taught them how to rule. Because paranoia, like rot, spreads. And when Henry died, he left more than just a corpse. He left a system. A machine of surveillance, built on silence, greased with fear. Edward VI was his heir. A boy king, sickly, 9 years old. But he didn't rule. Men ruled through him. Men who had studied under Henry and learned one brutal lesson. Power is not inherited. It is seized, and it must be defended at all costs. They whispered into the boy's ears, signed documents in his name, and waged wars wearing his crown. And behind them always was the ghost of the king who taught them how to rule by suspicion. When Edward died, the throne passed not to a prince, but to a revenant. Mary I, Henry's oldest daughter, returned, forged by exile and humiliation, a woman raised in the shadow of abandonment. Henry had cast her aside, stripped her title, separated her from her mother, declared her illegitimate, and now she was queen. And what did she do? She lit the fires. Literally, over 280 people were burned at the stake during her 5-year reign. Heretics, traitors, dissenters, or so she claimed. Others, they were ghosts from her father's court, the same kind of enemies he had once imagined, now reimagined through her. Historians call her Bloody Mary, but few ask the deeper question. Where did she learn cruelty? Not from nature, from legacy, from watching power defended with execution, not empathy. Then came Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry beheaded. Elizabeth's reign is often painted in gold, the Virgin Queen, the patron of art, the conqueror of the Spanish Armada. But look closely, and you'll see the cracks beneath the crown. She never married. She trusted no one. Her court was a spider web of coded letters, secret police, political theater. She wore beauty like armor, charm like a blade, because she knew from her father that to show vulnerability was to sign your death warrant. Elizabeth was not just ruling England, she was surviving it. And that is the rot Henry left behind. His true inheritance wasn't a church or an empire. It was trauma, wrapped in ermine and etched into law. Monarchy addicted to secrecy. A government built on preemptive betrayal. A family tree watered with blood. His wives may have died publicly, but his children, they lived in gilded cages, each one haunted by his decisions, each one forced to adopt his paranoia just to stay alive. Even today, we can still hear it echo. The Tower of London, still standing. The dungeons. The execution stones. The rooms where Anne Boleyn prayed, where Catherine Howard screamed. The throne, the one tourists now admire, once belonged to a man whose wounds leaked through silk. I know. If you walk through Hampton Court at night, they say you can hear him. The heavy steps, the labored breath. The weight of a body collapsing under the very indulgence it once celebrated. But that isn't the real haunting. His real ghost isn't trapped in the stone. It lives in systems. In traditions, in rituals, no one questions. In the silences we still keep. Because when fear builds power, power never lets it go. And what begins as protection ends in a curse. When kings die, the world usually pauses. Bells ring, crowds gather. History holds its breath. But when Henry VIII died, the world recoiled, because by the time death came for England's most infamous monarch, His body had already begun to betray him. It wasn't morning that greeted his final breath, but rot, gas, decay. Let's begin with the setting. January 1547. Winter wrapped the palace in silence. The fires were low, the court was uneasy, and Henry lay swollen, sweating, and semi-conscious. More corpse than king. His legs were black with ulcers, leaking pus and flesh, his breath thick with infection. He hadn't walked unaided in years. His legs, now more wound than flesh, leaked pus into his bedding. The ulcers had deepened, raw, blackened cavities so large they required daily draining. The smell, unbearable, even to his own physicians. Servants laid cloths along the floor, not as rugs, but to catch the pieces of him that fell off as they moved him from room to room. Yes, pieces. Chunks of flesh, flaking skin, strips of royal rot. They called him Majesty as they wiped his blood from the tiles. He hadn't ruled without fear in decades. And now, as his final hours approached, not even his doctors would draw near. They stood at a distance, whispering. None dared pronounce him dead. To declare a monarch lifeless before it was safe was treason, so they waited. Waited for silence. Waited for the smell to turn. When he finally passed, his body was treated not like a relic of power, but like a ticking bomb. And they were right to be cautious. You see, his body was toxic. So engorged with disease, so bloated with infection that internal gases built up fast. Too fast, they wrapped him in lead sheets, thinking it would contain the decay. They were wrong. The funeral procession began. A grand parade of mourning nobles, black horses, creaking wheels. His coffin, massive, sealed, reinforced. But the rot inside had other plans. Somewhere between Sion, Abbey, and Windsor, the unthinkable happened. The lead lining burst, coffin ruptured, exploding like a pressurized barrel of bile. The remains of the king splashed onto the road. Yes, you heard that right. Henry VIII's corpse exploded. And what happened next? Chaos. The horses reared. The hearse jolted. The scent. A stench that clawed into lungs, that burned the nose from the inside. Servants vomited on the spot. Some fainted. Others fled into the trees, choking, weeping, but the most haunting detail. Dogs, stray hounds from nearby villages, began licking the remains from the dirt road. The man who once called himself God's anointed became dog food. The court tried to hide it. Whispers were silenced. Chroniclers erased or reworded the event. It leaked, like the coffin. Because how do you bury a horror so graphic? It becomes a legend. Some accounts say the servants who cleaned the mess died within weeks. Infection, poison, curse by contact. No one knows for certain, but the fear stuck. And then came the burial. Windsor Castle. St. George's Chapel. They dug the grave wider than any king before him, not out of reverence, but necessity. His coffin was massive, too heavy, too unstable. The earth gave way beneath it. They tried again, and again. 3 attempts before the ground could bear his weight. Even in death, Henry refused to settle. He was finally buried. On top of Jane Seymour, his third wife, the one who died giving him a son. A poetic reunion. Hardly, he never asked for the burial to be with her. He simply had nowhere else to go. No grand tomb, no towering monument. Just a slab. A name. A secret beneath the stones. But the nightmare didn't end there. For years after his burial, people reported noises from the crypt, thumping, scratching, moaning. Some said it was rats, others air pockets. A few believed he was trying to get out. Visitors to Windsor swore they felt a chill near his tomb. A pressure, like being watched by something rotting but aware. And then came the smells. Clergy began complaining of a foulness that would come and go from the chapel. It didn't match any mold. It wasn't sewage. It was flesh decomposing. Still, decades later, royal engineers opened a vent near the crypt. And according to unofficial logs, they found discoloration on the surrounding stone and pools of black tar. So what are we left with? A man so consumed by fear, power, and indulgence that even death could not quiet him. His grave unstable, his body toxic, his legacy unfinished. Most kings are remembered for what they built. Henry is remembered for what he decayed, and perhaps that's fitting. He was a monarch of excess, a tyrant who believed himself eternal. But in the end, he proved one thing above all: no crown can stop rot, not in flesh, not in legacy, and not in memory. Power doesn't just reveal who a man is. Sometimes it creates something else entirely. Not a god, not a leader, but a monster forged in silence, fear, and gold. Let us remember who Henry VIII once was, not the grotesque figure in our minds, but the golden boy of England. He was young, tall, athletic. He played music, danced, debated theology. He could charm diplomats and command armies with the same breath. They called him the Renaissance Prince. People loved him. But love in the court of power is always conditional. And for Henry, that condition was control. It began small. A law here, decision there, a whisper punished, a rival removed. He told himself it was necessary, that a king must be firm, that mercy was weakness. But that's the first lie of power. It never asks to be fed, it demands. And Henry? He fed it. He fed it with loyalty, then blood, then family. One by one, those closest to him became expendable. Advisors turned to traitors. Friends became enemies. Wives became corpses. Anne Boleyn, whom he once wrote love letters to, was accused of adultery and incest and executed, not for her crimes, because she no longer served his purpose. That's what unchecked power does. It makes use of people, and when they're no longer useful, it erases them. Henry built a court of mirrors. He surrounded himself with men who said only what he wanted to hear. He outlawed dissent. He turned confession into treason. He made fear the law of the land. Not because he was born evil, but because power rewards paranoia. It tells you that the only safe man is one who trusts no one, not even his own blood. By the end, Henry had turned against nearly everyone. His once loyal confidants dead. His wives dead, divorced, or disgraced. His daughters watched like criminals. His only son raised not to love, but to rule without softness. He had become a king in name, but a prisoner in truth. His throne was made of iron, but his soul had become a cell. This is the horror no history book teaches. Not the leg wounds, not the burst coffin, not the feasts or the screams, but the transformation. The erosion of a man into a machine of survival. He couldn't stop. He didn't know how, because power, once tasted in full, is addiction. It offers safety at the cost of your humanity. It offers silence at the cost of your conscience. It offers legacy at the cost of everything else. We often say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in Henry's case, it didn't just corrupt, it consumed. There's a moment in every tyrant's story where they can still turn back, point where the mirror cracks, and they glimpse the man they used to be. We don't know if Henry ever had that moment. If in his final days, lying bloated and bedridden, he saw himself clearly, or if he still believed that the crown absolved him, that being king made his sins divine. But history does not absolve, it remembers, and it whispers. The real tragedy, he could have been great. He had the gifts, he had the charisma, the mind, the heart. Once, but history doesn't judge us by our beginnings. It judges us by what we become. And Henry became something terrifying, a living warning, breathing monument to what happens when no one dares say, enough. Even now, his shadow looms in the way power is protected, in the way dissent is punished, in the way legacy is sculpted by those who write the stories. We are still living in the echo of kings who forgot that they, too, are mortal, that even the loudest voice will one day fall silent, and when it does, all that remains is what we did to others, while we still believed we were untouchable. So ask yourself, what does power do to a man? Not in the first year, but in the 20th, in the 40th. After all, the applause fades. After all, the enemies are gone. After even the mirror no longer tells the truth, it does this. It turns charm into command, command into control, control into isolation, and isolation into madness. Henry didn't die when his heart stopped beating. He died long before that. Bit by bit, day by day, his fear became his counsel, and cruelty became his cure. This is not just a history lesson, it's a human one, because the throne may be gone, but the hunger for power that lives on. In every leader who surrounds themselves with yes-men, in every system that punishes honesty, in every voice that says, it's for the greater good, as the cost climbs higher. The lesson of Henry VIII isn't locked in the past. It walks beside us, watches from behind gilded portraits, and waits for someone to feed it again. So now that we've seen it all, the stench, the screams, the broken bodies, and broken promises, what remains? What does the story of Henry VIII give us? Modern people, wired into digital lives, far removed from crowns, corsets, and cobblestone courts. It gives us this, a mirror, not to judge a king long dead, but to understand the living, because for all the horror, for all the rotting flesh and shattered marriages, Henry VIII's story is not just about him. It's about what happens when power is worshipped more than wisdom. We live in an age where we still admire strong leaders, where ruthlessness is mistaken for confidence, where control is sold as safety. But Henry VIII wasn't strong. He was terrified of betrayal. He was terrified of weakness, terrified of death, so he tightened his grip on people, on power, on fate itself, and the tighter he held, the more everything slipped away. This is the first lesson. Strength without accountability isn't strength at all. It's tyranny in a costume. Costumes always rot eventually. We're also taught constantly to chase more status, more wealth, more indulgence. We glamorize excess. Big homes, larger-than-life personalities. It's overconsumption sold as success. But look at Henry. He had it all, and it destroyed him. His indulgence wasn't pleasure, it was poison, and not just to his body, but to his soul. He fed on everything around him, food, people, loyalty, until there was nothing left to consume but himself. Excess, without restraint, becomes a slow suicide. And today, that truth has only grown louder. Our age may not be ruled by monarchs, but we are ruled in quieter ways by hunger, for approval, for power, for more. We're drowning in it and calling it freedom. And then there's fear. Henry's favorite weapon, and ultimately his most faithful companion. He wielded fear like a sword, silenced his court, controlled his people. But the blade turned inward. He trusted no one, not even the faces he once loved. That's the final irony of fear used as power. It never stays pointed at others. Eventually it comes for you, and when it does, it's no amount of gold, no palace, no army can shield you from what's inside your own mind, because in the end, Henry didn't just rot on the outside. He decayed from within. Paranoia corroded his judgment. Indulgence hollowed his body. Power stripped away everything that made him human. He was king of a nation, but prisoner of his own throne, and that is the real tragedy. Not that he died grotesquely, but that he lived so miserably, despite having everything we're told we should want. So maybe the question isn't, how could he have done all that? Maybe the better question is, how close are we to doing the same? Every time we excuse cruelty in the name of strength, every time we envy the excess of those above us, every time we choose control over connection, we walk a little closer to the path Henry carved through history. Not as kings, but as people. People who forget that power without purpose is a plague. That indulgence without meaning is emptiness in disguise. And that fear left unchecked doesn't protect us. It deforms us. So what do we take from this tale of rotten ruin? Not disgust, not judgment, but warning. And perhaps wisdom, that true leadership isn't domination, it's responsibility. That legacy isn't what we build on the outside, but what we leave behind in others. And that sometimes the most terrifying monsters in history weren't born evil. They were made one unchecked decision at a time, just like any of us could be. If this story made you pause, made you see that history isn't just dates and dusty portraits, but blood, betrayal, and bone-deep fear, then you've only just begun to scratch the surface. Because buried beneath the crown, beneath marble statues and royal hymns, are countless stories that were never meant to be told. Stories of kings who were less than men, and empires built on silence. The truth is, what we call history is often just the version the powerful survive too, right? But here, we unearth the forgotten. We drag the bones into the light. We ask the questions no one dared whisper in a throne room. So if you're ready for more, if you're ready to see behind the velvet curtain, hit that subscribe button. Because this channel isn't about fairy tales. It's about the truth beneath the legend. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, even kings can rot.